This is the Leica Q3 43. It's a follow-up version of the super popular Leica Q3 with a new 43mm lens. I actually reviewed the Q3 back in 2023, so instead of revisiting what I said in that video, the main purpose of this video is going to be focused on the experience of this new 43mm f2 lens and how it changes the way the Q3 feels from the original 28mm. A lot of my original thoughts with this camera have remained unchanged, so anything not covered in this video was likely covered in my previous video. I recommend watching that review of the Q3 after you finish this video. If you are only interested in this version of the Q3, I've done my best to cover the most important aspects, as well as many of my updated thoughts since I had this camera last. With that said, let's get started. This video is sponsored by MPB, more on them a little later. When I first heard the rumors of the Leica Q3 43, I thought it was too good to be true. For several years now, I've had it in my mind that the perfect walk-around setup was a full-frame camera paired with a 40mm lens. There's a few reasons for this. 40mm is a common focal length used in film production because it balances distortion-free portrait shots while being wide enough to capture landscapes without too much compromise. A good example of this is cinematographer Roger Deakins' choice to use a 40mm for the film 1917, which was shot as if it was all one take.
1917, we only used one lens. We had to use one lens because it was one shot. It was a 40, which equivalent of maybe 32 probably. That sense of slightly focused on the character with the drop off onto the background. That slight isolation, but it's not like a long lens, obviously. It's quite a wide lens still.
The second reason I've always gravitated toward a 40mm lens is that it's very close to the natural field of view that we see out of a single eye. Now, because we have two eyes, humans see a much wider field of view overall, with the estimation that our vision falls between 35mm and 50mm on a full frame camera. Therefore, a 40mm is a great middle ground, giving a very familiar "you were standing there" feeling to images, whereas a 35mm or 50mm feels slightly different from what we see with our eyes at any given moment. By choosing a 43mm for this design, Leica clearly understands this nuance and decided to take their already popular Q3 and attempt to create a shooting experience no other brand has. We'll get into if they actually succeeded in delivering on this in a moment, but first, a quick physical comparison. Practically, this camera hasn't changed much. The lens itself is nearly identical in size to the previous Q3, being only slightly longer on the lens itself. We have the same bottom release focus tab, aperture ring, 49mm filter thread, and the rear macro adjustment on the lens. On the body, there is the same minimal button layout, battery release, tilting screen, and bottom mounted SD card slot, which I still don't like because of how close it is to the tripod mount on the camera. It's pretty clear where Leica's priorities are with this design. The Q343 is as much a fashion accessory as it is a camera, which is important because unless you carry a large bag or backpack with you, you'll be wearing this on your body. This camera is not small or pocketable for a fixed lens point and shoot. It's definitely meant to be worn as you go about your day. I had just over a week to test out the Q343 before needing to send it back to Leica. In that time, I did a mix of city photography and some landscapes while I was out with my family. This 43mm lens is spectacular. I have previously used a similar setup to this camera in my Leica M10 and a Voigtlander 40mm f1.2, but that setup never quite performed the way I wanted it to. The Voigtlander 40mm has always felt like it was missing something. It didn't have enough character to be consistently interesting, but wasn't sharp enough to deliver clean results either. The Apple 43mm on the Q3 is the opposite. This lens is as sharp as they come. When you combine that sharpness with the 60 megapixel full frame sensor in this camera, it's a recipe for clean, contrasty images that deliver quite a bit of punch. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I tend not to prefer images this contrasty and sharp. However, when you consider the kinds of situations you would take a point and shoot camera like the Q3 into, like an event, on your daily walk, or on a vacation to a beautiful place, this look works well. The 43mm focal length really does deliver a very similar feeling to my own eyes for each place I took this camera. I did have to take some time to calibrate the way I was composing shots with this lens though. It actually feels strange to have what you see with your eyes immediately match what you see through the viewfinder, at least through one eye. When I shoot with a 35mm or a 50mm lens, I'm very attuned to the difference each focal length has compared to my eyes. With those lenses, placing myself in the right spot for the composition I want is second nature. With the Q3 I needed to get used to physically being exactly where a shot looked good to my eyes before I pressed the shutter. It's not a perfect one-to-one experience, but it's the closest I've ever felt with any camera before. 5mm from a 35mm and 7mm from a 50mm might not sound like a big difference, but in practice it changed my experience of shooting a lot. As my testing went on, I started to really enjoy composing this way. If I could see a shot with my eyes that I liked in a given spot, this camera could capture exactly what I saw. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword. If you can't physically get to a spot where you're happy with what you see with your eyes, then you won't get the shot that you want. I had this experience a few times with some of the landscapes that I shot. There were just certain places where it wasn't practical or possible to get quite far enough away for the shot that I wanted. I did only run into this with landscapes though, which you could argue is the less important use case for this focal length. For portraits, this lens was beautiful. I got plenty of shots of my sons that I absolutely love, and I think in 10 years time, when I look back at these photos, I will feel like I was right there in the moment. Just like on other Q series cameras, having the ability to flip to macro mode on a lens like this was actually really useful. It gave me a feeling of closeness that I haven't experienced with many other lenses. This is something most M-mount lenses I use on my M10 struggle with because they don't always have the close focus that I would prefer. Now, for all the positives so far, I do have to note some downsides. I am personally used to Leica's not having autofocus, so the fact that the Q3 has it is nice. However, the autofocus on this camera feels like it's multiple generations behind pretty much all other modern cameras in 2025. There is a lot of focus hunting, and I definitely missed my fair share of shots of my son because the autofocus could not keep up with him. I also wish there was a joystick on this camera because I often opted for a single point autofocus just to guarantee more consistent results. When it comes to handling, the Q3 fits in my small hands quite well, but I can see how if you were spending all day gripping the camera for street photography, that it might start to get uncomfortable. I also found the EVF to be worse than I remember the last time I had the Q3. Even after adjusting it to my eyes, it's not quite as sharp as I would hope for in a camera at this price point. If it's your thing, manual focusing feels fast and immediate on this lens, with the only downside being the in-camera peaking doesn't feel particularly useful or accurate, at least not when shooting wide open. Battery life on this camera is solid, and at least within the first few years of owning it, you should be able to get a full day's worth of shooting on a single battery, especially if you top up with a power bank through the Type-C port in your downtime between shots. I didn't personally find myself using the digital lenses available on the Q3, but having a built-in way to go from a 60 to 150mm composition could still be useful. I just didn't personally find a need for it. I think the entire appeal of a camera like the Q3 comes down to one main idea. Limit the number of decisions that need to be made to actually go out and just take some photos. If you're anything like me, when you go out with a camera, especially when packing for a big trip, you've probably spent an unreasonable amount of time considering what lenses to bring with you. Trying not to put yourself in a situation where you have to live with regret. This experience of decision fatigue has left me overpacking my gear more than a handful of times, and no matter how many years I've done this, it's still a part of packing that is easy to struggle with. The Q3 never makes you go through this. On paper, this distinction might not seem like a big deal, but when you are rushing out the door on a whim for a last-minute hike or to go to an event you want to bring your camera to, the lack of needing to decide on what lens to bring could easily be the difference between bringing your camera at all or not and being forced to just take photos on your smartphone. Now that I am a dad of 2 kids, the logistics of getting out of the house to go anywhere leaves absolutely no time for me to think about what lens to bring out for the day. Having fewer choices can be a great thing. Next, let's talk about the image quality. If you use Leica's Photos app, you can download Leica Looks to the Q3, which is essentially Leica's take on film simulations baked into your JPEGs. Personally, I didn't love the look of any of these by default, and you can't go in and customize them the way you can with a Fujifilm simulation. So unless you like how they feel as is, there is a lack of customization here. It's also a bit disappointing that you can't import these Leica looks as a profile in Lightroom and use them as a starting point for your edits on your RAW files the way that you can with a Fujifilm camera. As for the rest of the image quality of this camera, it's pretty hard in 2025 to have a high resolution sensor like this deliver poor image quality. That being said, I do think that as a starting point, images from the Q3 can feel a bit on the cooler side and quite contrasty. So depending on how you want your shots to feel straight out of camera, this could be a pro or a con. Personally, as I've gotten older, I tend to gravitate towards warmer images, so I found myself correcting out the cool tones from these files when editing. Either way, raw files from the Q3 give you a lot of latitude and resolution to color or crop your images to get exactly the shot that you want. With the main downside being that these files are huge at almost 80 megabytes per shot if you shoot raw. And subjectively, the raw files from the Q3 feel slightly less unique than the files I've worked with from my older Leica M10. I'm not sure if that has to do with how Leica has evolved the way they process colors in camera or something to do with this sensor specifically, but it is something I felt when working with these files. At the end of the day though, this isn't a big deal because you can edit files to look however you want with enough effort. So if you're willing to spend the time editing, I don't see this being a huge negative. You can undoubtedly get great looking images from this camera. Now, I wouldn't recommend attempting to shoot any kind of professional video on the Q3 but this lens used for video is pretty awesome. As long as autofocus isn't a top priority for you, the color and the detail of the video from the Q3 is honestly much better than it should be for a camera that is not at all designed for pro video. If you want a professional looking shot in a casual setting, this will definitely do the trick. L-Log feels great, and if you are on vacation in a beautiful place, this would be a great way to grab a memory. Footage from the Q3 will hold up much better over time than any video shot on your smartphone. The main hang-up to the video on the Q3 is when you switch modes from stills to video, you'll have to physically adjust your shutter speed if you want ideal video settings, which makes the process feel clunky if you're going back and forth between stills and video a lot. It would be nice for Leica to design a way for the settings to be independent of each other like you can find on other cameras. I was also curious if the in-camera focal lengths were doing any oversampling of the sensor for better footage when punching in. However, when comparing an 8K wide shot to all the other focal lengths, it looks exactly the same as punching into the shot in post. Useful if you wanted to do this in camera, but otherwise the same result as doing it yourself in editing software after the fact. Overall, I'm pretty torn on the Q3 On one hand, I like this focal length a lot more than the 28mm f1.7 on the standard Q3. It's a unique perspective and a very immediate feeling shooting experience, which makes it a lot more fun to walk around with. That being said, this camera is north of $7,000 USD, which is a lot of money for a camera that probably won't be used for professional work, at least not for most people. Leica clearly wants this camera to be a very unique shooting experience, and it is. Even if you put a 40mm lens on a mirrorless camera to try and mimic this experience, I don't think it would ever quite feel the same. There is something to the perspective shift you have towards a point-and-shoot camera that focuses you on one lens only. I wouldn't personally use a workhorse full-frame mirrorless camera in the same situations as the Q3, and I think that's what makes this camera so appealing. A camera like the Q3 doesn't have to fit every situation, but for the ones that it does fit, you will probably have a lot of fun. Whether that is worth the price of admission, only you can decide that for yourself. Personally, as much as I love shooting with this camera, it's a tough financial pill to swallow. If the physical design quirks and autofocus performance don't bother you at all, and the idea of the 43mm lens perspective is what you want for your images, you are probably exactly who this camera is made for, so if you have the money to spend, I doubt you will be disappointed. If the cost of this camera has you on the fence though, you could always save some money by picking up a used alternative from the sponsor of today's video, MPB. MPB is the largest global platform to buy, sell, and trade used photography and videography gear. If you go to their platform right now, you have the option to pick up many great alternatives to the Q3. We have the original Leica Q, the Leica Q2, both of which are significantly less expensive than a brand new Q3, as well as cameras like the Sony RX1R Mark I and Mark II, which is a great full-frame point-and-shoot alternative to the Q3. They even currently have the difficult-to-get Fujifilm X100VI, which has been out of stock brand new at many retailers for a lot of this year, but you can buy it used on MPB. That is only a few of the solid alternatives with many more to choose from on their platform. MPB isn't a marketplace. They actually buy gear directly from people like you and me, and their team of product specialists evaluates every single item before reselling them. So you never have to question the quality of the products that you purchase. I'm a huge advocate for used gear and have bought a lot of used gear myself over the years, and I recommend that you consider it as well. MPB also provides a 6-month warranty on all products that have been carefully inspected by their team, so if you don't need to buy a brand new camera, you can check out MPB at the first link in the video description. Thank you to MPB for making this video possible, and thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great day.